St. Johns County Sheriff's Office. How can I help you?
I was wondering, can I get somebody to do a wellness check?
Okay, and what's the person's name?
His name is Father Rene Roberts. I think my brother might have done something to hurt him and stole his car and everything. He made the comment to my dad that Father Rene was tied up.
Do you mean that he's busy or physically tied up?
Physically. And my brother is just crazy enough to do that. He's tied my sister up a couple years back and tried to kill her. That's what we're afraid of, that he might have hurt the old man.
St. Johns County Sheriff's Office.
Yes, ma'am. I called last night to have a well check done on Father Rene Roberts in St. Augustine, and nobody ever called me back to let me know the verdict of that.
1 second, okay. It says that they didn't actually go out with him. His vehicle was also not there.
Mr. Rene Roberts is not answering his phone still. We're worried about that man.
I got a phone call from my sergeant at the time, and he told us we had a missing priest. And when he told me who it was, it kind of set me back on my heels a little bit.
We made contact with the person who cleaned his apartment, and patrol deputies went inside the apartment with her, and he was not there. I noticed there were some couple of drawers that were pulled out. There was mail everywhere. There was food on the kitchen counter, which appeared that somebody may have taken a bite or two and kind of just left it there.
There was no obvious signs of a struggle. There was no blood. So it looked like he could have just up and left.
Father Rene was very prominent in St. Augustine, which is a town with a very large Catholic population. He had retired from the full-time priesthood, but still did services and different functions for the church.
It'd been several days that no one, even very close individuals, had not heard from him.
The Catholic Church told us about Father Rene missing several appointments, which was very out of character.
It's like he fell off the face of the earth.
My brother was a saint. He always said he was going to be a priest someday. He loved helping people. I remember when he came home and said to my mother and father, I want to teach the deaf. And then he eventually went in to teach the blind too. My brother saw the potential in so many people, and they were your family, no matter who they were. Sometimes I used to think he carried the world on his shoulders because he just wanted so much to make people happy.
A.V. Law says her family expected Father Rene to do the prayer service for her 88-year-old grandfather Monday night.
Very sad, and we'd like answers.
The next morning, the priest didn't make it to the funeral home either, and a military chaplain had to step in.
Definitely had a sinking feeling.
Since then, fears about what happened to Father Rene have grown.
So tell me who Father Rene is to you.
So the first time I talked to Father Rene was right after I had my brother arrested. When I asked him to not bond him out, we wanted him to stay there and dry out. My brother is Stephen Murray.
Okay.
My brother got out. He got released from jail. And Father Rene called me when he got out. My brother had already contacted him for money and rides and stuff like that.
Okay.
She told the detectives that Father Rene had become involved with individuals that were troubled per se, that had been in jail. He always tried to actually help him recover, get on the right path. And Father Rene was trying to help Stephen with drug addiction and drug use.
So what made you call the sheriff's office?
My dad came over, and my brother had been staying over there with them since he got released from jail.
Okay.
And so I asked him, you know, how Stephen was doing. He said Stephen left with Father Renee the night before, and that was the last time he'd seen him. I've been dialing his number ever since, like for the past 2 days, and it's going straight to voicemail.
Okay.
And so I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, what if this man is hurt? Stephen is a violent person.
Okay.
So, I mean, we just feel like he might have hurt that man.
Does your dad know about all this?
We got a feeling he does, but we think he's trying to cover up for my brother.
Behind the Signal 8 vehicle, we got a Corolla, blue in color. We're on 207 headed towards 95, and looks like he doesn't want to stop.
We're talking he's doing 115, 120 miles an hour on I-95. It's a high-stress situation.
We knew that it was not Father Rene driving. He would never flee from a traffic stop.
We'd get close enough to see there was a white male individual in the driver's seat, but we could not identify him.
I've got him right in front of me. 433 here. We need that vehicle stopped.
We suspected the driver may be Stephen Murray, but we were not sure 100%.
If you can't safely do that, I want you to back off. It's not worth it.
All right, we're in the construction zone. We're going to have to slow it down, guys. 54. We lost him in the construction. We all backed off.
It was a little bit frustrating and upsetting. Whoever was driving the car was a critical piece of the puzzle for us to be able to get to where Father Rene was. Bobby was there by himself. We told him, listen, we need to figure out where Stephen is. We need to talk to him. Bobby said, I can't help you and find him. While we were at his father's residence, Stephen contacted Bobby Murray on the phone and told him that he was running from the police. Stephen said, well, I just outrun multiple deputies. The officer spoke with him and told him he needed to turn himself in. Now we just have to find him.
As an investigator, you're a little conflicted on trying to expedite and get as much information as you can as quickly as possible. There were some things that I would have liked to have confronted Bobby Murray on, but we wanted to make sure that we kept him talking and that we didn't give him a reason to be offended or terminate the interview.
Hello. How you doing, sir? My name is Gene Tolbert. I'm a detective with the Major Crimes Unit in St. Johns County. And I realize this is probably a crazy situation for you to be in. But I need your help. Okay? Your son's in a little bit of trouble. Alright? And we need to figure out how we're going to handle this. Okay?
You said a little bit. What you talking about?
Well, I can't answer that right now. Okay? So that's why I need to know what you know, and I can compare it to what I know, and then it kind of gives me a direction from there.
We were working against the clock as far as Father Rene's well-being goes. There was still a hope that we would be able to bring Father Rene home alive. We really felt like that Bobby was going to be the key to unlocking this investigation.
I got a call from detective, and he said, Father Rene, he's missing, and people are very worried. I was so scared for him. I had this feeling I was just so scared for him.
Let me ask you this. Tell me, what do you know as far as your son's activities for the past 3 or 4 days?
He came to the house last night. He walked up to the house. He was drinking. He left the house about 4 hours ago. When he left, he took my phone with him.
Any idea where he went to?
No.
Okay.
He didn't say. He just told me he'd be back in a little while.
When he left earlier, how did he leave?
He drive. I don't know what kind of car it was.
Could it have been a Toyota Corolla?
It could have been. I don't know.
Well, the reason why I ask is because that's what he was driving tonight when the police chased him.
Yes, sir. I'm saying it could have been.
Okay. And no idea where that car came from?
No, sir.
The car that we spoke of, that you said Stephen showed up in your house, it actually belongs to Father Rene, the person who's been reported missing out of St. Johns County. And the circumstances in which that person went missing are very suspicious. As a detective, my number one question is why is Stephen driving this man's car? And where's this man at?
I'd be honest with you, I don't know. He called me. He said, I got 15, 20 cops cars behind me. And I asked him, I said, son, what the hell are you trying to do? He said, I don't want to leave no more here. He said, I don't want to leave.
Okay.
And that's the exact words he told me. And I told him, I said, son, don't do that to me.
Right. I'm with you.
I can't deal with that.
I'm very concerned about some of Stephen's statements about wanting to die, and I don't want to see Stephen hurt or dead or anything any more than you do. And if he has this kind of, attitude, and
this is what's gonna happen.
I
already know.
I'm just asking you for your help the best you can.
I was sitting there. That's before he took off.
There are so many scenarios that are possible. If you were to call Stephen right now and tell Stephen that if he wants you to come pick him up, that you'll come pick him up.
He ain't let me do it. He knows I'm here with y'all. He ain't going back to prison.
But I still gotta find this man.
I would have no idea.
After talking to Bobby Murray for a period of time, it seemed futile, and he was just eating away at the clock.
Hang tight with me, and I'll get right back with you, okay?
Yes.
All right.
If he had information, it was pretty clear he wasn't going to share it with us. Blood is thicker than water. It seemed like he would do everything he could to protect his son.
This is exclusive video of Father Rene's family leaving the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office after getting an update on the search for the missing priest. They told me they didn't want to go into detail, but they appeared disappointed and frustrated.
They had tracked the phone to a sparsely populated, heavily wooded area. SWAT starts working down this fire break in the woods, searching for Stephen, and they come upon Father Rene's vehicle. As they're approaching, they find Stephen Murray behind the wheel. Stephen apparently sees some motion or light in his rearview mirror, starts the car up and takes off.
However, he ended up crashing and running away from the vehicle.
So he has fled into basically the jungle.
We thought maybe Father Rene is in the trunk of that vehicle. When they approached and looked, Father Rene was not in there. At that point, we suspected that something bad happened to Father Rene, but we did not know. We want to bring him back home, whether alive or deceased. Finding Stephen and capturing him alive was a priority.
Just to know that he could kind of be lurking above, kind of in the tree canopy, is a pretty scary scenario. After several hours of kind of keeping constant pressure and perimeter on this area, working it with teams, dogs, and helicopters, we kind of catch a break, and finally, Stephen comes down. I think it was very tiring on Stephen, and I think he just ran out of wind. Fortunately, he didn't have a weapon with him at the time, and he was forced to concede and surrender.
Stephen Murray was originally from Aiken County, South Carolina. We have a history with this guy. My experience in dealing with Stephen, anytime, especially an overbearing male figure moved in aggressively towards him, Stephen would automatically put that wall up and he would shut down. And eventually he's gonna lawyer up.
Let's see that green chair. Gentlemen, you want to shut this door here? Gentlemen, if you would. No, thank you. Oh, man. You gentlemen work that's not paying attention. Where'd you do your time at? Man, much better. I mean, not 20-something per.
My first and major concern, as everybody's, was for the safety of Father Rene. That's priority. Where is he? Is he safe? But time starts to become our enemy. And Stephen was the only person above ground who knew where Father Rene was. He was the only person.
I know you're not going to ask for it, but would you like something to eat? We're hungry.
I didn't tell you. I'm hungry enough to eat the ass out of a whore.
Okay, let me work on that.
Yeah. I'm just tired, man. I'm really not, man. I'm very, very tired, man. I wish somebody could just help me. I mean, just take this from me, man.
That's what I'm here for. I'm here to talk to you and tell me what I need to do to help you.
Where the hell you get that from?
I like it. We've been driving all day.
Yeah.
So, which one do you want?
No, probably want that.
It's easy to have conversation while you're eating food. Takes some of the pressure off. Also, that releases some chemicals in their body, especially if they haven't had any of that in a while. Sometimes makes them a little bit more talkative.
How in the hell did Florida charge me with aggravated fleeing and eluding? And they don't even know that was me driving.
Didn't you talk to a policeman that night? On the phone?
Yeah, I talked to a policeman.
Yeah. Did you tell him you were driving the car?
Talked to a JSO. He said, man, I don't know what you did, but you pissed him off and they want to talk to you. I said, okay, well, I'll turn myself in and talk to him. Didn't tell him I was driving though.
At that point, after eating, we knew he was settled. He was ready to go. He knows that now we're going to start getting into some questioning in more of a confrontational way.
But how fast were you driving to lose all the police cars?
I wasn't driving.
I'm not going to argue with you about it. We know you were, okay? Because you told your dad, you told your sister. You know, we didn't just magic our ways up here.
So you have his car. We haven't heard or seen him since. How does that look?
I understand.
How does that look?
But just because something looks some way, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to refer. It doesn't look good. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It does not look good. This man is missing. We're just out here trying to find him.
I'm a law-abiding citizen. Man, I like smoking a cigarette, man. Y'all asking a lot of questions. If there was something I could do to help you, you know what I'm saying, do that, I would.
When did you get his car?
I think I called him and told him that I had some money for him if he wanted to come get it.
Where do you think you're at?
I think he picked me up right there by my dad's.
What did you do after that?
Me and Father Renee was riding. He didn't know that I was going to meet somebody for some weed, which I didn't tell him that because, you know, he's a priest. I was supposed to be meeting a dude at the kangaroo right there. So I asked Father Renee if he would stand right here for a minute. You know, Father Renee usually does that. I dropped him off, and I never came back. I mean, I ended up doing drugs, and I never came back and got him. And that's how I got his car. And I'm like, oh, shit, I'm in trouble, you know? I shouldn't have did that. And it was too late, you know, so I just kept the car, you know what I mean?
What did you do after that?
Just drove, and I was scared. I mean, I know that I was in trouble.
What do you think he is right now?
I don't know. No.
Did you ever go back out to that area to look for him?
I'm not sure. I mean, I was probably on drugs and mine somewhere else, you know? I can't even give you an exact date, but it's not something that I keep up with. I can't accurately say that because I don't know.
About what time did you drop him off?
So
on Sunday?
I'm not sure which day it was. I mean, I'm really not sure.
We had been talking to him for such a long time, and we were going in circles.
Never been to it. I don't know, man. I don't really know, man. I mean, I'm not real familiar with that area. But,
what was he wearing last time you saw him?
I think he's asking a lot now. I mean, you know, I couldn't honestly tell you what he was exactly wearing.
He's giving non-specific answers. His defenses are up. I don't think we're getting anywhere. So I felt like we need to push it a little bit harder. It's kind of a make it or break it part of that interview, because all Steven's got to do is say, I want my lawyer.
Listen, I think you know a lot more than what you're telling me.
I mean, he could be alive and well somewhere right now. He could be on vacation for all I know. I mean, he hasn't told me anything. He hasn't told y'all anything. So therefore, we all don't know. I mean,
Steve, come on now. I'm asking your help. Any piece of information that you can give us so that we can bring him home.
Okay.
That's...
Well, I mean, I'm answering every question you asked, I know.
Well, that's the things that we don't think you're being truthful about.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's opinion, you know. Opinions like ass. Everybody's got one, you know.
What do you think? Is he dead?
I mean, I couldn't tell you. I mean, me personally, I don't know. I mean, I couldn't tell you if he's dead or alive. I mean, because I don't know.
What do you think happened to him?
Well, you just asked that, and I just gave you an answer. You know, you're asking the same questions, expecting a different answer. You know, that's the definition of insanity. I mean, so if you're gonna keep on trying to dig at it, then we ain't got nothing to talk about.
What do you mean?
I mean, you ain't getting nowhere. I mean, if I won't continue to ask the same questions, then I don't think there's nothing else we need to talk about. Smoke a cigarette, man. Y'all got my nerve to a slap up, man. Asking all these 1,100 questions.
Oh, where are you stalking, man?
You want to get a cigarette?
Smoke 2 at a time?
You can see by his attitude he was going to shut down and not talk to us anymore, but you cannot give up.
Our job during this interview, get him talking, keep him talking. I was not there to get the confession. It was to make sure that I left the door open for another investigator at another time.
Well, we ready to go, ain't we?
We rocking and rolling, man.
Ready.
What's going on?
I can't call it, man. Another interview? Man, them jokers that just left, they were asking the same question over and over and over again. And I'm just looking at them, man. Can't be serious.
Oh, you're gonna try to make it more comfortable too. The last time I saw you, we were putting you in an ambulance to go to the hospital.
It's probably an overdose.
It was. Kind of an awkward angle.
Now, you remember me, right?
I do.
We sat in my office, remember?
Yes, sir, I do.
And we were straightforward. You were younger then.
I was 16.
Well, you had just turned 17. You just turned 17. The last time we spoke was a burglary. Remember the samurai sword?
Man, you got a good memory.
I do have a good memory.
A good memory.
I do have a good memory.
You can watch his body language. He's uncrossed his arms. He's sitting back in the chair again. He's not slumped over. He's looking up again.
It was best for people that he had encountered in the past to walk in that room, just put him a little bit more at ease. Stephen Murray had had a very, very difficult and abusive childhood. We knew if you touched on that emotion that Stephen carries inside of him and then back off of it, that would open a door, a floodgate.
I'm wondering, you've got a decent head on your shoulders. Why would you get messed up in something that you got to be sitting in a sheriff's office at some ungodly hour?
Well, you know, it's like you got this baby, this newborn baby, and you raise that baby. Hate, hurt, destroy, rape. You know, and the baby grows up on that.
Becomes a product of their environment.
Becomes a product of the environment.
You got it rough.
Yeah, I mean, but hey, what can I do about it, you know?
Get dealt the hand, you do what you can with it.
Right, you pray about it, but hell, my knees is tired and my knees is getting sore. My damn knees are sore. I got calluses on them. I need some more prayer.
You know what? Those calluses tighten you up, man. I don't blame you for that.
I am who I am. So I jump out the car and run, and y'all holler, "Don't do it, Steve," and that's how good y'all know me.
You were straight with me, and I was straight with you.
I tried my whole life to change who I am. I'm a sick puppy. I mean, I'm sick. I try to be that.
And it tires you out, don't it?
It destroys me.
You're mentally tired.
Because I don't want to be that
You're
person.
not physically tired, you're mentally tired.
Mentally, I mean, I'm
You need a
tired.
rest. You need a mental rest. But, do you know where it really all begins?
Begins with you being honest with yourself.
There you go.
Stephen came back to life. He was initiating, he was engaging. And when that happens, that opens the door for the potential for something else to follow up.
We're done. Let's go smoke. I don't smoke, but you are. Here. You right-handed, right?
I
Give
am.
me your left hand.
I walked out being 100% satisfied with what we got because I knew there's an opportunity for tomorrow.
The search for Father Rene is not over. Numerous sites have already been looked at, and more are to follow. Father Rene is still missing, but his presence is still felt at the San Sebastian Catholic Church.
We are going to find him, and we're going to bring him home.
How you feel about going back to Florida, man?
I feel real good. Damn, girl, you made it up here?
We thought that I was going to soften him up and get him to talk.
It was obvious that they had a very close relationship, but there was a calculated risk in putting Bobby Jean in this position. Stephen was being so unpredictable at that point. Everybody's fear was that he was going to shut down completely.
We brought your sister here. She's obviously told us that you got a big heart, that you're not a bad man. We're just trying to bring closure to the family, find out where he's at, so we can bring him home.
And I don't want you to think that I'm going against you right now. I just want you to do the right thing for a change. Okay? I'm not going to look at you any different than you being my brother, and I love you.
Love you too.
Tell me one thing. You ain't got to say nothing else. Just say yes or no. Can I help him or not?
I don't know, Dean.
I think we want to see you do the right thing, and, you know, regardless of whatever it is, we're here.
Thank you, Dean. I appreciate it. And I ain't got nothing to say. I mean, I ain't got nothing to say to you. I mean, I really don't.
You ain't willing to throw me any hints?
All the way to the grave. Like I always have. I'm sorry I had to taste this plate with me. I'm sorry, baby. I mean, we all make bad decisions in our life. Unfortunately, I made a lot of them, you know?
There was a moment you can see his face expression change, his body posture change, and he kind of just slumped to the side, and all of us were convinced that he was going to break down. And we thought that was the moment for us to actually go at him hard.
They're building a big case for you down in Florida.
You look like the Statue of Liberty, and I'll try to knock it down.
Yeah, well, that's not gonna happen.
We need to bring the priest home. You just got to face him. Okay? And lying is not going to fix anything.
I think I'm lying, man.
Because you are.
You are, Stephen.
Call me a liar to my face.
That's right.
Well, I mean, I reckon I like to exercise my rights then.
I felt like he punched me in the mouth when he said that.
He pulled the trigger and did his Miranda warnings, and that was that. We're done. I tell you, it was soul crushing to be that close.
The reality was that we may never be able to locate him. We had to come up with a new strategy on how to move forward and get our heads back in the game.
Hey,
What you doing?
we're going through hell out here that we don't even deserve. People talking to us, talking about that we used to help you cover up stuff and all, and we probably know where Father Renee is. We don't know how much more we can handle. I just broke down and cried yesterday because we don't deserve this. My kids don't deserve this.
I'm sorry, Gene. I mean, hell, what do you want me to do? I mean, tell me.
I just want you to be honest with them, regardless of the situation. This ain't gonna be over with until they find Father Renee.
I love you with all my heart.
My cell phone rings, and I learned Stephen Murray has asked to speak to detectives. We didn't know about what, but he wanted to talk to us.
He had made a phone call to Bobby Jean, and I do believe that conversation with Bobby Jean could have been a very pivotal moment for Stephen. I was hoping that Stephen was ready to talk. He was getting ready to get it off his chest and tell us.
Okay. All right. It's your show, brother. We're just here to watch. Tell us.
Right. Well, the first part of the story I told y'all where Father Renee picked me up and I was going to pay him the money, which was true. And I picked him up after I got back from the dope trap down off 90. And we went up to South Carolina, I said, I want to see my kids.
Did he say he didn't want to go?
He said no point that he didn't want to go. He just said, okay. I mean, I wasn't aggressive with it or anything, I wanted to go see my kids.
Where's he at in the car?
He's in the trunk by that point.
He's in the trunk. Okay. Is he tied up or anything like that?
No, sir.
How'd you get him to get in the trunk?
I asked him to.
Did you say or else?
No, I didn't say or else. I said, I need you to get in the trunk, Father Renee. He said, okay. Climb right in there, I helped him in there and told him, I said, just do what I tell you to and everything's going to be okay, And, I'm talking to him, and he's still telling me, that I'm in great trouble and that I'm never going to get away with this. And I'm thinking, oh man, maybe I am in a great deal of trouble. I guess I got real skitsed out, man. Scared, I guess, scared for me, scared for my life.
Is there something that snaps in your head, like, hey, I got to take care of this, or this is going to be a problem, or?
If he going to go back and tell on me, though, and get me in trouble, and let's go ahead and get rid of you,
Okay. So tell me about that. What happened with that?
Well, he's steady talking to the trunk, he's hollering, I gotta use the bathroom, and I said, okay, I'm gonna let you out in just a second, and so I stopped and let him out to use the bathroom. I had a 9mm, and I shot him.
Okay. So, like, me and you are looking at each other right now, you shot him like that?
It was more of from the side, and then he fell, and I shot him in the head.
Okay.
And left.
Just listening to Stephen talk about the way he murdered Father Rene in such a cold and callous way, it's one of the times in my career that I've actually felt the presence of evil in an interview room.
Shot him in the chest one time and in the head the last time.
Stephen finally confessed Father Rene was no longer alive. He's dead somewhere, but he still needed to come clean and tell us where the body was. Finding the priest and bringing him back home and making sure that the family got a proper burial for him was critical.
Well, tell us what happened with where you say you killed Father Rene. Where did that occur at? Like on the side of the road or a gas station?
Side of the road.
Okay.
It's a real wooded area.
Real wooded area?
Yeah, like, y'all would have never found him. It happened in Georgia, closer to South Carolina.
You know what highway it is? What road? 'Cause I know you know those roads like the back of your hand up there.
Yeah.
You know it better than I do.
Yeah, I know the roads, but I would have to take you.
Okay.
To it, because period. I don't want to sit here. I like to ride for a minute, but as far as like taking you to the exact location, I would have to be in the car and point it out.
So we were all thinking he's playing games again.
I think that gave Stephen a certain sense of power and authority, and that he was in charge in that situation, but the decision was made to put Stephen in a car. And almost immediately when we pulled up, we saw a flock of buzzards kind of take off, which kind of drew our attention over, and you could see Father Rene's body laying at the edge of the woodline. It's an emotional roller coaster, obviously. Tugs on your heart. It eats away at your being sometimes, but it's about getting to the truth.
Ultimately, it's very important that we find closure for loved ones of the deceased.
It was a special ceremony for a man who meant so much to so many here in our community. People came from all over to say goodbye to the beloved priest. He touched the hearts of so many.
He was a gift and a blessing to us.
And with that, it was time to send off Father Rene.
Without the interviews, I don't think that this case would have came to the conclusion that it did. And I do believe that justice was served in this case, but I don't think there's any amount of resolution for this case that would ever satisfy anybody. People saw the killing of a Catholic priest as kind of an attack on our very fiber. And I really think that stirred emotion in a lot of people. Father Rene had actually talked about possibly dying at someone's hands in the future. And that if that had ever happened, his wishes would be that that person not be subjected to the death penalty. So it was agreed upon that Stephen would plead guilty to life in prison for malice murder, and he would spend the rest of his life behind bars.
I believe it was a gift from my brother, Father Rene, to love and not hate, no matter what. So I, in my heart, have forgiven Stephen for taking my brother's life. I know my brother's with God, and we'll be all together someday. But you gotta let it go. You gotta let anger go and the hatred go and just love.
I'm going to tell you about a murder that refused to stay buried. A crime scene that seemed frozen in time. A killer who vanished into the ordinary rhythm of American life without leaving a name behind. For nearly 4 decades, every unanswered question echoed through one quiet neighborhood. Every anniversary reopened the same wound, and every detective who inherited the file faced the same impossible reality. Somewhere, a man had beaten a young mother to death, walked away in broad daylight, and never looked back. Then, when almost everyone believed the truth had disappeared forever, science uncovered a voice that time could not silence. But before DNA finally spoke, there was only blood, grief, and a mystery so haunting that it became one of New Jersey's most unforgettable cold cases. The morning of March 1st, 1988, began like countless others in the peaceful township of Harrington Park, New Jersey. It was the kind of community where neighbors recognized every passing car, children rode bicycles through quiet streets, and violent crime belonged to television broadcasts from distant cities rather than everyday conversation. The homes were comfortable, the lawns carefully maintained, and the illusion of safety felt almost permanent. Dorothy Donovan lived inside that illusion. She was 37 years old, a devoted mother, a wife, and someone whose routine rarely changed. Friends described her as warm, dependable, and deeply committed to her family. Nothing about her life suggested she would become the center of a murder investigation that would stretch across generations. That afternoon, Dorothy was home alone. Her husband, Charles Donovan, was at work. Their teenage son had gone to school. The house sat quietly, blending into the peaceful suburban landscape. To anyone driving past, it looked completely ordinary. No one heard screaming. No one reported a violent struggle. No one called police. Sometime during those ordinary daylight hours, someone entered the Donovan home. Whether Dorothy knew him has never been established with certainty. There were no obvious signs of forced entry that immediately pointed investigators toward a break-in gone wrong. That single detail would haunt detectives from the beginning. Had she willingly opened the door? Had the killer surprised her after entering through an unlocked entrance? Or had the attack begun before she even realized someone else was inside? The answers died with her. Inside the home, violence erupted with terrifying speed. Investigators would later conclude that Dorothy fought desperately for her life. Furniture had been disturbed. Objects were displaced. Evidence suggested movement from one area of the house to another as the confrontation intensified. This was not an execution carried out in seconds. It was a struggle. A brutal one. The attacker used overwhelming force. Dorothy suffered devastating injuries from repeated blows delivered with extraordinary violence. The assault continued long after she was no longer capable of defending herself. The sheer level of rage visible at the scene shocked experienced investigators. It was the kind of overkill that often suggested something deeply personal, yet almost nothing about the victim's life supported that theory. There were no obvious enemies. No public disputes. No known threats. Just an ordinary woman whose ordinary afternoon had transformed into unimaginable horror. Hours later, the nightmare revealed itself. Charles Donovan returned home expecting another routine evening. Instead, he stepped into silence. The house felt wrong. Investigators would later describe many homicide scenes where family members sensed something before seeing anything. A light left on, an unusual stillness, a door slightly open. For Charles, that instinct became reality within moments. He found his wife. The image was so horrifying that first responders would remember it years later. Blood marked the violence that had unfolded inside the home. Dorothy lay lifeless after enduring an attack so savage it seemed impossible within the calm surroundings of suburban New Jersey. Emergency personnel could do nothing. She had been dead for hours. The neighborhood that had always felt protected suddenly became the center of an active homicide investigation. Police flooded the quiet streets. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across manicured lawns. Television crews arrived. Curious neighbors gathered behind barricades, struggling to understand how something so monstrous could happen only a few houses away. The question spread almost immediately. If someone could kill Dorothy Donovan inside her own home during the middle of the day, who would be next? Investigators approached the case with urgency. The first priority was reconstructing Dorothy's final hours. Neighbors were interviewed one by one. Delivery drivers, postal workers, construction crews working nearby, anyone who might have noticed an unfamiliar vehicle, anyone who might have seen someone walking through the neighborhood, anyone who heard an unusual sound. But memories proved frustratingly vague. One resident believed he had noticed an unfamiliar man earlier that day. Another thought a vehicle had been parked near the Donovan residence. Others remembered absolutely nothing unusual. The very normality of the afternoon became the investigation's greatest enemy. Nothing dramatic had interrupted daily life. People were working, shopping, collecting children from school, running errands. The killer had blended into that ordinary rhythm. Crime scene technicians examined every inch of the house. Every fingerprint. Every shoe impression. Every strand of hair. Every possible biological trace. In 1988, forensic science was advancing rapidly, but remained limited compared with modern standards. DNA analysis existed only in its earliest investigative applications and was far from becoming the powerful identification tool familiar today. Detectives relied heavily on traditional investigative methods. Fingerprints, witness interviews, blood typing, physical evidence, elimination of suspects. Piece by painstaking piece, they attempted to assemble the final moments of Dorothy's life. One discovery immediately complicated the investigation. Some personal property appeared to be missing. The possibility of robbery entered the picture. Had a burglar encountered Dorothy unexpectedly? Had panic escalated into murder? Or had the missing items merely been taken afterward to disguise the real motive? Nothing fit neatly. Experienced homicide investigators recognized another disturbing possibility. Sometimes killers intentionally staged robbery scenes. Sometimes stolen property represented little more than an afterthought. Sometimes the truth hid behind the illusion of randomness. Attention naturally shifted toward those closest to Dorothy. Investigators examined family members first. It was procedure. Charles Donovan cooperated extensively. He provided detailed timelines, submitted to questioning, allowed investigators complete access to financial records, family history, and personal relationships. His account remained consistent. His work schedule was verified. No evidence connected him to the killing. The investigation expanded. Friends, former acquaintances, business associates, neighbors, repair workers, anyone who had entered the Donovan home during previous months. Nothing produced a convincing suspect. Detectives also examined whether Dorothy had unknowingly crossed paths with someone dangerous. Had she interrupted a burglary elsewhere? Had she attracted unwanted attention during routine errands? Had someone become obsessed with her? Again, no answers. The brutality of the attack remained impossible to ignore. Behavioral analysts reviewed the evidence available at the time. Some believed the excessive violence suggested emotional involvement. Others argued that panic during a burglary could escalate unpredictably. Still others considered the possibility of a transient offender, someone passing through the area with no connection whatsoever to Harrington Park. Each theory solved one problem while creating another. As investigators searched for motives, Dorothy's family entered a nightmare of waiting. Funeral arrangements replaced ordinary routines. Media interviews replaced private grieving. Every ringing telephone raised hope that police had identified a suspect. Every day ended with disappointment. Her teenage son now faced life without his mother. Friends attempted to support the family, but grief became inseparable from uncertainty. Knowing someone you love has died is devastating. Not knowing who killed them creates a different kind of suffering. It transforms mourning into permanent suspense. Police released limited information to the public, hoping someone might recognize details that seemed insignificant at first glance. Did anyone see a stranger? Did anyone notice unusual activity? Had someone recently asked questions about the Donovan family? Tips arrived steadily. Most led nowhere. One caller believed a suspicious man had visited homes pretending to perform maintenance. Another claimed a drifter had been seen walking nearby. Others suggested former acquaintances whose names investigators had already examined. Each possibility required time. Each consumed resources. Each ultimately collapsed. Weeks turned into months. The homicide investigation remained active, but momentum slowly weakened. This pattern repeats itself in countless unsolved murders. During the first days, evidence pours in. Witnesses remember details. Media attention remains intense. Then life resumes for everyone except the victim's family. Detectives understood this reality all too well. They refused to abandon the Donovan case. Boxes filled with reports accumulated. Crime scene photographs were cataloged. Evidence was preserved carefully. Every document represented another attempt to capture the truth before memory faded completely. Even then, some investigators sensed that the key to solving Dorothy's murder might already exist inside the evidence collected from the house. The problem was painfully simple. Technology had not yet caught up. Microscopic traces recovered from violent crimes often remained silent because laboratories lacked the scientific tools to interpret them. Biological material that today could identify a suspect with astonishing precision frequently sat untouched inside sealed evidence envelopes during the late 1980s. Nobody could predict how important careful preservation would become. Detectives simply followed protocol. Store everything. Label everything. Protect everything. Someday. Maybe someday. Science would find answers hidden where investigators could not. But in 1988, that future remained unimaginable. The headlines gradually disappeared from newspapers. Television cameras left Harrington Park. The crime scene tape came down. Neighbors returned to ordinary routines, though ordinary no longer meant the same thing. Doors were locked more carefully. Strangers drew longer stares. Parents reminded children not to answer unexpected knocks at the front door. Fear had quietly settled into a community that had once believed violence happened somewhere else. Inside police headquarters, however, Dorothy Donovan's file never truly closed. It simply moved from the active desk to the cold case shelf, carrying with it a promise that every detective hoped one day could be kept. Somewhere beyond those pages, beyond the fading photographs and carefully preserved evidence bags, the man responsible was still alive, still free, and still carrying a secret that had survived the passage of time. The investigation refused to die, even as the headlines did. Every few months, another detective would pull the Donovan file from the shelf, spread the photographs across a desk, and ask the same question that had haunted the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office since the spring of 1988. What had everyone missed? Somewhere inside thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, crime scene diagrams, forensic inventories, and interview transcripts, there had to be one overlooked detail capable of changing everything. Yet every review ended the same way. The evidence remained stubbornly silent. The killer remained invisible. Cold cases possess a strange kind of gravity. Unlike fresh investigations driven by urgency, a cold case lives in the minds of those who refuse to let it disappear. Detectives retire. Prosecutors change. Laboratory technology evolves. Entire police departments modernize. But the victim remains exactly as they were on the day they died. Dorothy Donovan would forever be 37 years old. Time marched forward for everyone except her. The Donovan family tried to rebuild their lives, but the murder lingered in every quiet moment. Holidays arrived carrying an empty chair at the dinner table. Birthdays became painful reminders of the years she never lived. Every family milestone was shadowed by the same unanswered question: who had taken her away? Friends often described a peculiar feeling whenever they drove past the house. The neighborhood looked unchanged. Children still played outside. Lawns were still carefully trimmed. Mail was still delivered every afternoon. Life had continued with remarkable determination, yet one address seemed permanently frozen in memory. For longtime residents, it was impossible to pass without remembering flashing patrol car lights, yellow crime scene tape, and television reporters crowding the sidewalk. Investigators never stopped receiving occasional tips. Most arrived after television reruns about unsolved crimes or newspaper anniversary articles. Someone believed they remembered a suspicious van. Another caller insisted an old acquaintance had once confessed during a drunken conversation. Some tips came from psychics claiming supernatural visions. Others arrived anonymously with little more than vague accusations against neighbors, former co-workers, or complete strangers. Every lead had to be examined. Every allegation demanded at least a preliminary review. Every possibility consumed valuable investigative hours. Nearly everyone collapsed under scrutiny. Some suspects possessed airtight alibis. Others had never been anywhere near Harrington Park. Several had already died. Each dead and deep in the frustration. As years passed, investigators began looking beyond the immediate circle surrounding Dorothy. They broadened the search to include offenders with histories of violent burglaries throughout northern New Jersey. Could the murder have been committed by a transient criminal passing through affluent suburbs looking for easy targets? The theory held some appeal. Daytime burglaries were not unheard of. A homeowner unexpectedly returning could easily transform a theft into a homicide. Yet Dorothy had not returned home unexpectedly. She had already been there. That distinction mattered. If robbery had truly been the motive, why unleash such extraordinary violence? Why continue the assault with such relentless force? Experienced homicide investigators understood that burglars often wanted one thing above all else: escape. Lingering at a crime scene increased the risk of capture. The sheer brutality inflicted upon Dorothy suggested an attack that lasted longer than necessary. Behavioral experts remained divided. Some argued that panic could trigger explosive violence. Others believed the level of overkill reflected intense rage. Still others warned investigators against reading too much emotion into physical injuries. Human behavior during violent crime rarely followed predictable patterns. The file grew thicker. Crime scene photographs faded slightly with age. Witness memories became less reliable. People moved away. Some died. Others simply forgot details that had once seemed insignificant. Memory, investigators often said, is evidence with an expiration date. Physical evidence, however, can outlive memory. That simple truth quietly transformed homicide investigations throughout the United States during the 1990s. Forensic science entered a revolution. DNA technology, once experimental and available only in limited circumstances, rapidly matured into one of the most powerful investigative tools ever developed. Laboratories learned to recover genetic profiles from increasingly smaller biological samples. Techniques improved. Accuracy increased dramatically. Cases that had once seemed impossible suddenly became solvable. Police departments across the country began reopening evidence lockers. Boxes untouched for years returned to forensic laboratories. Old clothing, weapons, hair, blood, saliva, cigarette butts. Tiny fragments once considered scientifically useless suddenly became potential witnesses. The Donovan investigation was no exception. Evidence collected inside Dorothy's home had been carefully preserved. Detectives who originally worked the case had no idea whether future science would unlock hidden answers, but their meticulous documentation now proved invaluable. Technicians reviewed every item again. Some samples produced nothing useful. Others had degraded over time. Several pieces of evidence remained unsuitable for meaningful DNA extraction using the technology then available. Still, laboratories continued trying. Science advanced almost yearly. Methods that failed one decade occasionally succeeded the next. Meanwhile, investigators revisited the original witness interviews with fresh eyes. One statement attracted renewed attention. A witness had described seeing an unfamiliar man walking in the area around the time of the murder. His appearance seemed ordinary enough that no immediate alarm had been raised. Medium build, casual clothing, nothing especially memorable. Ordinary. That single word often frustrates homicide investigations more than any other. Violent offenders rarely resemble movie villains. They shop for groceries, stop for coffee, smile politely, and disappear into crowds. Their greatest disguise is normality. Detectives wondered whether the unidentified man represented their killer or simply another resident going about his day. Without additional evidence, they could not know. Other witnesses remembered unfamiliar vehicles. Again, descriptions varied. One recalled a light-colored sedan. Another believed it might have been darker. License plate information did not exist. Investigators traced countless vehicle registrations. Nothing connected convincingly to Dorothy's murder. As the case entered another decade without an arrest, media coverage shifted in tone. Early reports emphasized fear. Later stories focused on mystery. Eventually, the murder became known primarily as a cold case. Journalists interviewed retired detectives who admitted the investigation had haunted them for years. Some confessed they occasionally reopened the file at home, convinced they had overlooked something obvious. Others spoke about the emotional burden of informing Dorothy's family that there were still no answers. Families of homicide victims often describe time differently. The calendar continues. The investigation does not. Every anniversary becomes another reminder that justice remains unfinished. Dorothy's relatives continued hoping each telephone call might finally deliver long-awaited news. Instead, years accumulated. 10, 15, 20. Children who had not yet been born when Dorothy died grew into adults. Technology transformed nearly every aspect of everyday life. Cell phones replaced payphones. The internet reshaped communication. DNA databases expanded nationwide. Yet Dorothy's killer remained unidentified. Investigators increasingly recognized that solving historical murders required more than persistence. It demanded patience bordering on obsession. Cold case detectives approached evidence differently from their predecessors. Instead of asking who looked suspicious in 1988, they asked what evidence could be reinterpreted through modern science. Could overlooked fingerprints now be digitally enhanced? Could biological material previously considered unusable produce a DNA profile? Could computerized databases identify patterns impossible to recognize decades earlier? The answers slowly became encouraging. National DNA databases expanded significantly. Convicted offenders submitted genetic samples under evolving state and federal laws. Thousands of unknown profiles entered forensic systems. Every new submission created another possibility. Perhaps one day, one comparison would finally produce a match. Detectives waited. Months became years. The anticipated notification never arrived. The unknown DNA recovered from the Donovan case, if it belonged to the killer, did not match anyone already in the system. That revelation proved both disappointing and strangely hopeful. Disappointing because no immediate suspect emerged. Hopeful because it suggested the biological evidence might truly belong to the offender rather than innocent contamination. The profile existed. The science worked. Only the identity remained hidden. Behind the scenes, another revolution was beginning. Unlike earlier advances, this one did not rely exclusively on criminal databases. It relied on family. Investigators across America watched several astonishing cases solved through an entirely new strategy known as investigative genetic genealogy. Instead of searching for exact DNA matches among convicted offenders, specialists examined partial genetic relationships found in publicly accessible genealogy databases. Distant cousins, shared ancestors, family trees stretching backward through generations. The approach sounded almost unbelievable. A tiny biological sample left at a crime scene decades earlier could eventually lead investigators towards someone who had never submitted DNA to police at all. Not because the suspect volunteered. Because a distant relative had uploaded genetic information while researching family history. The method demanded extraordinary patience. One match rarely solved anything. Genealogists built enormous family trees containing hundreds, sometimes thousands, of individuals. Branches expanded. Names multiplied. Birth records. Marriage certificates. Military documents. Obituaries. Census records. Every historical document became another clue. Slowly, impossibly, anonymous DNA transformed into a network of real families. Several famous cold cases fell through this method. Police departments nationwide began reconsidering evidence previously believed unsolvable. If those investigations could identify killers decades later, why not Dorothy Donovan's? Within the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, optimism quietly returned. The evidence had survived. The DNA profile existed. The technology was finally catching up with the crime. For the first time in many years, investigators sensed they were no longer simply preserving history. They were actively hunting again. Somewhere, a man who had successfully escaped justice since 1988 had no reason to believe anyone was still searching for him. He had lived through changing presidents, changing technology, changing neighborhoods, and changing generations. Perhaps he believed the evidence had deteriorated beyond usefulness. Perhaps he believed every detective who remembered the case had already retired. Perhaps he convinced himself that the murder had become nothing more than another forgotten newspaper clipping buried inside dusty archives. If so, he misunderstood one fundamental truth about cold cases. Time does not always erase evidence. Sometimes it strengthens it. Sometimes every passing year brings science one step closer to answering the question investigators could never solve on the day blood stained the floor of a quiet suburban home. And somewhere inside a carefully preserved forensic sample collected nearly 40 years earlier, the killer's own biology was waiting with remarkable patience, carrying a name that no detective had yet spoken aloud, but one that history would not allow to remain hidden forever. The breakthrough did not arrive with flashing lights, dramatic confessions, or an anonymous phone call in the middle of the night. It arrived quietly, inside a laboratory, through a process so methodical that it seemed almost detached from the horror of the crime itself. There were no emotional speeches, no dramatic confrontations, only scientists examining fragments of DNA that had waited, preserved in silence, for nearly 4 decades. For investigators who had inherited Dorothy Donovan's file long after the original detectives had retired, this moment carried enormous weight. Many had never met Dorothy's family. They had never walked through the original crime scene or interviewed frightened neighbors while memories were still fresh. Instead, they knew the case through evidence boxes, aging photographs, handwritten notes, and transcripts whose paper had yellowed with time. Yet they had become just as invested. Cold case investigators often describe a strange connection with victims they never knew. They spend months studying the smallest details of a life interrupted. Favorite routines, family photographs, employment records, medical histories, grocery receipts, holiday cards. Every ordinary detail gradually transforms a name in a file into a real person. Dorothy was no longer simply victim number 1. She became a mother who laughed with friends, a wife whose absence permanently changed a family, a woman who had expected nothing more extraordinary than another ordinary Tuesday. That personal connection fueled an extraordinary level of persistence. The forensic evidence collected in 1988 had been reviewed repeatedly over the years, each time with better technology than before. Earlier DNA techniques had produced only limited information. Later methods generated more complete genetic profiles. Eventually, the biological evidence reached a point where investigators believed it could support investigative genetic genealogy. The concept sounded almost impossible to anyone unfamiliar with modern forensic science. Unlike traditional DNA databases, which compare crime scene evidence against known offenders or arrestees, investigative genealogy searches for relatives. Not brothers. Not parents. Sometimes fourth cousins. Sometimes even more distant connections. Those seemingly insignificant genetic relationships become the starting point for an enormous historical reconstruction. Professional genealogists begin assembling family trees. 1 generation becomes 2. 2 becomes 6. Soon hundreds of names cover digital charts stretching back more than a century. Birth certificates reveal parents. Marriage licenses connect families. Military records confirm identities. Obituaries identify surviving relatives. Newspaper archives fill missing gaps. The process resembles solving an immense puzzle without knowing what the finished picture should look like. Investigators understood from the beginning that genealogy would not produce an immediate suspect. Instead, it would narrow an impossibly large population into one extended family. From there, traditional detective work would take over. Who had lived near Harrington Park in 1988? Who matched the approximate age? Who could have traveled through the area? Who possessed a criminal history? Who remained alive? Who had died? Every branch required careful examination. Weeks turned into months. The family tree continued expanding. At first, the DNA pointed toward people who appeared to have absolutely nothing to do with New Jersey. Entire family lines stretched into different states. Some relatives had emigrated decades earlier. Others had changed surnames through marriage. Genealogists patiently worked backward before moving forward again, tracing descendants 1 generation at a time. The work demanded extraordinary precision. 1 incorrect birth record could send the investigation in the wrong direction. 1 mistaken assumption could waste months. Slowly, however, patterns emerged. Several branches converged toward the same extended family. Within that network, investigators identified individuals whose ages aligned with someone capable of committing the murder in 1988. The list remained far too large. Dozens of names still required evaluation. Detectives began eliminating candidates one by one. Some had lived across the country. Others were children at the time. Several had documented military service overseas. A few possessed medical conditions making the attack physically impossible. The pool steadily shrank. With every eliminated name, attention focused more intensely upon those who remained. One individual gradually stood apart. His background placed him within reach of the crime. His age fit. His movements could not immediately be explained. Most importantly, investigators realized he had never been considered during the original investigation. His name had never appeared inside the 1988 case file. No witness had identified him. No tipster had mentioned him. For nearly 40 years, he had existed entirely outside the investigation. That realization carried profound implications. The original detectives had not failed to recognize the killer. They had simply never encountered him. But suspicion alone solves nothing. Investigators needed confirmation. Genealogical analysis provides direction, not proof. To establish guilt, detectives required a direct DNA comparison between the crime scene evidence and the suspected individual. Obtaining that comparison presented its own challenge. Police could not simply demand a DNA sample without legal justification. Instead, investigators turned to surveillance. This stage of a cold case investigation often unfolds with remarkable patience. Detectives watch. They wait. They collect discarded items abandoned in public places. A drinking cup. A tissue. A cigarette. A napkin. Anything carrying biological material voluntarily left behind. Courts have repeatedly recognized that abandoned property may be collected without violating privacy expectations in many jurisdictions. If the recovered DNA matches crime scene evidence, the investigation changes instantly. Officers quietly observed the suspect's daily routine. He appeared entirely ordinary. Neighbors described him as unremarkable. No dramatic outbursts. No obvious attempts to avoid police. No behavior suggesting a man carrying decades of violent secrets. That normality unsettled investigators. How many times had people passed him in grocery stores? Shared elevators? Waited beside him in traffic? The image contrasted sharply with the brutality documented inside Dorothy Donovan's home. Eventually, investigators obtained a discarded item suitable for forensic testing. The laboratory comparison began. Every step followed strict scientific protocols. Independent verification. Quality controls. Repeated analysis. No shortcuts. No assumptions. The result carried enormous consequences. If the DNA failed to match, months of genealogical work would collapse. Investigators would return almost to the beginning. If it matched, one of New Jersey's oldest murder mysteries would finally have a face. The waiting felt endless. Then the laboratory reported its findings. The genetic profile obtained from the discarded sample matched the biological evidence preserved from Dorothy Donovan's murder. After nearly 40 years, science had finally identified the man investigators believed entered Dorothy's home that March afternoon. Inside the prosecutor's office, the atmosphere changed immediately. The case that had spent decades inside filing cabinets suddenly became active again. Search warrants were prepared. Additional evidence was reviewed. Investigators revisited every available document, now seeing familiar details through an entirely different lens. Questions that once seemed impossible became surprisingly practical. Where had he been living in 1988? Did he know the neighborhood? Had he committed similar offenses elsewhere? Could anyone place him near Harrington Park? Did old employment records reveal travel through the area? Every discovery built upon the DNA evidence. Unlike the speculative theories that had dominated earlier decades, investigators now possessed something objective. DNA does not speculate. It does not rely upon fading memory. It does not change with time. It simply records biological reality. Yet even after identifying the suspect, another unsettling question remained. Why Dorothy? Nothing immediately suggested a personal relationship. No long-standing dispute surfaced. No obvious family connection appeared. No clear financial motive emerged. If investigators had indeed identified the killer, the reason he selected Dorothy remained buried somewhere inside his own memory. Behavioral experts reconsidered the crime from this new perspective. Perhaps the murder truly had begun as a burglary interrupted unexpectedly. Perhaps Dorothy encountered the intruder before he expected anyone to be home. Perhaps panic escalated into overwhelming violence. Or perhaps motives existed that only the killer himself could fully explain. The crime scene alone could never answer that question. As detectives assembled the final investigative timeline, they appreciated how narrowly the truth had escaped permanent loss. Had evidence been improperly stored, the DNA might have degraded. Had original investigators failed to preserve biological samples, no comparison would ever have been possible. Had forensic science advanced more slowly, the suspect might never have been identified. Justice often depends not only upon determination, but upon timing. In Dorothy Donovan's case, those two forces had finally intersected. Almost 40 years after blood stained the quiet suburban home, investigators believed they finally knew whose blood had silently accompanied it. The discovery represented far more than a successful forensic investigation. It demonstrated something detectives had preached for decades. Cold cases are not dead. They are waiting. Waiting for better witnesses. Waiting for improved science. Waiting for one overlooked clue to acquire entirely new meaning. For Dorothy's family, however, science offered something more complicated than celebration. After nearly 40 years of unanswered questions, they stood on the edge of learning the identity of the man who had stolen a wife, a mother, and an ordinary future. But knowing a name would not erase decades of grief. It would not restore birthdays missed. It would not replace holidays spent wondering whether justice would ever arrive. It would simply answer the question that had echoed since March 1, 1988. Who? Investigators finally believed they knew. The only remaining question was whether the legal system would have the opportunity to confront the man whose DNA had patiently waited inside an evidence locker for nearly 4 decades, preserving a truth that neither time nor memory had been able to destroy. For investigators, identifying a suspect did not mark the end of the case. It marked the beginning of the most delicate phase of the investigation. A DNA match, no matter how compelling, was only one piece of a criminal prosecution. Detectives still had to answer the questions a jury would inevitably ask. Could the evidence withstand scrutiny after nearly 40 years? Had the biological material remained uncontaminated? Was there any innocent explanation for its presence? Every possibility had to be anticipated long before a courtroom ever came into view. The investigative team returned to the Donovan file with renewed intensity. Boxes that had remained sealed for years were opened once more. Every photograph was enlarged. Every handwritten note was reread. Every witness interview was revisited, this time with one crucial advantage. The detectives were no longer searching blindly. Now they knew who they were looking for. That single change transformed the entire investigation. Details that once seemed meaningless suddenly demanded attention. Addresses were compared against old maps. Employment histories were reconstructed. Vehicle registrations from the late 1980s were examined again. Public records revealed movements that had gone unnoticed decades earlier. The suspect's life, ordinary on the surface, became the focus of an exhaustive reconstruction stretching back almost 40 years. Investigators wanted to know where he had lived, where he had worked, who had known him, whether anyone remembered unusual behavior around the time Dorothy Donovan was murdered. The challenge was obvious. Nearly 4 decades had passed. Memories fade. People relocate. Employers close. Documents disappear. Entire neighborhoods change beyond recognition. Yet history always leaves traces. Former co-workers were located. Some struggled even to remember his face. Others recalled him as quiet, reserved, unremarkable. It was the description detectives encountered repeatedly. He seemed normal. That phrase appears with unsettling frequency in homicide investigations. The public often imagines violent offenders as visibly dangerous, permanently angry, impossible to overlook. Reality is far less dramatic. Many offenders blend effortlessly into ordinary society. They pay bills, attend family gatherings, hold steady jobs, wave to neighbors. Nothing about their appearance hints at the violence hidden somewhere in their past. As detectives interviewed people connected to the suspect, they encountered genuine disbelief. Several could not imagine him committing such a crime. Others admitted they knew very little about his personal life despite years of acquaintance. One of the peculiar truths about adulthood is how little many neighbors truly know one another. A friendly greeting, a brief conversation about the weather, perhaps a wave while mowing the lawn. Beyond that, entire lives remain private. Investigators were careful not to draw conclusions from personality alone. Their confidence rested elsewhere. DNA. Objective. Measurable. Independent of opinion. Still, prosecutors understood that jurors often expect more than scientific evidence. They seek motive. They seek explanation. They want the story behind the crime. And in Dorothy Donovan's case, that story remained incomplete. Why her? The question persisted despite the extraordinary forensic breakthrough. Detectives explored every plausible scenario. One possibility remained that the killer had entered the neighborhood intending to commit burglary. Affluent suburban communities frequently attracted property offenders looking for homes that appeared temporarily unoccupied during working hours. Dorothy's presence inside the house may have been entirely unexpected. If the intruder encountered her suddenly, panic could have erupted into catastrophic violence. The theory explained certain aspects of the case. It explained the apparent theft of personal property. It explained the daytime timing. It explained the absence of any established relationship between victim and suspect. Yet one troubling detail refused to disappear: the level of violence. Experienced investigators repeatedly returned to the same observation. The assault had been extraordinarily brutal, far beyond what many burglaries involving surprised homeowners typically produced. Behavioral analysts remained cautious. Violence, they reminded detectives, cannot always be measured logically. Fear, adrenaline, desperation, all possess the ability to transform seconds into uncontrollable explosions of force. The human mind under extreme stress rarely behaves according to predictable formulas. As prosecutors assembled the case, forensic experts meticulously documented every stage of evidence preservation. This would become one of the most important aspects of any future prosecution. Defense attorneys in cold case trials frequently challenge chain of custody. Who collected the evidence? Where was it stored? Who handled it? Could contamination have occurred? Every signature mattered. Every storage record mattered. Every laboratory report mattered. Fortunately for investigators, the original evidence had been preserved with exceptional care. The detectives who worked the Donovan homicide in 1988 had followed procedures that, although designed decades earlier, proved remarkably reliable. Evidence envelopes remained sealed. Documentation remained complete. Laboratory transfers had been carefully recorded. Without realizing it, the original investigative team had protected the future. Many of those detectives had long since retired. Some had passed away. Others watched the renewed investigation from afar, astonished that the evidence they collected early in their careers had finally begun speaking with clarity. For them, the breakthrough carried deep personal meaning. Cold cases become unfinished chapters in a detective's life. Retirement does not erase them. Neither does time. Many investigators quietly carry the names of unsolved victims for decades. Each breakthrough feels like fulfilling a promise made years earlier. Meanwhile, Dorothy Donovan's family received updates unlike anything they had heard in nearly 40 years. For years, every conversation with investigators had ended with cautious disappointment. No new leads. No significant developments. Please remain patient. Now the tone had changed. There was progress. Real progress. Not rumor. Not speculation. Scientific evidence. Hope arrived carefully. Families who have lived through decades of uncertainty often hesitate to celebrate prematurely. They have experienced too many false starts. Too many promising leads collapsing under closer examination. This time felt different. Still, they waited. Investigators also examined whether the suspect could be connected to other unsolved crimes. Violent offenders sometimes commit multiple attacks separated by years or even decades. Cold case detectives compared homicide databases, sexual assault investigations, burglary records, assault reports. Neighboring jurisdictions were contacted. Patterns were sought. No definitive series emerged. If the suspect had committed additional violent crimes, they either remained undiscovered or lacked evidence sufficient to establish a connection. That possibility carried disturbing implications. Perhaps Dorothy had not been one victim among many. Perhaps she had been the only one. Or perhaps she represented only the only crime investigators could finally prove. Without confessions or additional forensic evidence, certainty remained impossible. The renewed investigation attracted growing attention within law enforcement. Cold case units across the country watched closely. Every successful prosecution based on decades-old evidence reinforced an important message. Never discard biological evidence. Never assume science has reached its limits. Tomorrow's technology may answer questions that today's laboratories cannot. The Donovan investigation became another powerful example of patience rewarded. Yet, even as optimism grew, one unavoidable reality overshadowed everything else. Time. Time changes suspects. Time changes witnesses. Time changes victims' families. Most importantly, time changes the possibility of justice. The suspect investigators identified was no longer the man he had been in 1988. He had aged nearly 40 years. The strength required to carry out such a savage assault belonged to a younger version of himself. Neighbors now saw an older man living an apparently ordinary life. Few, if any, suspected that law enforcement had quietly placed him under intense scrutiny. Detectives debated strategy. Should they approach him immediately? Continue gathering corroborating evidence? Seek additional forensic testing? Every decision carried risks. An interview might produce admissions. It might also provide opportunities for deception. Silence could preserve the element of surprise. It could also delay inevitable legal proceedings. Experienced investigators understood that patience had already served them well. There was no reason to abandon it now. Behind closed doors, prosecutors evaluated every conceivable challenge the defense might raise. Could DNA alone establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? Would jurors accept evidence collected decades earlier? Could missing witnesses weaken the presentation? Every scenario underwent careful analysis. The burden remained exactly what it had been in 1988. Prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Nothing less. As preparations continued, investigators reflected upon how astonishingly close this murder had come to remaining permanently unsolved. Had evidence storage conditions been slightly different, the DNA might have degraded beyond usefulness. Had one technician discarded a seemingly insignificant sample, the investigation could have ended forever. Had genealogical science developed only a decade later, the suspect might never have been identified during his lifetime. Justice sometimes depends upon an extraordinary combination of persistence, scientific progress, and simple fortune. Dorothy Donovan's case embodied all three. Nearly 40 years after her death, investigators finally possessed what generations of detectives had sought. A name, a genetic match, a path toward accountability. But one final obstacle remained beyond anyone's control. The legal system can prosecute only the living. And while science had finally outrun time in identifying Dorothy's suspected killer, Investigators could not yet know whether time itself had already delivered its own irreversible verdict before a courtroom ever had the chance to hear the evidence. Time has a cruel habit of rewriting investigations. When detectives first stood inside Dorothy Donovan's home in March 1988, every hour mattered. Witnesses still remembered where they had been. Tire tracks were still visible. Telephone records could still be retrieved. Fresh evidence still held the warmth of recent violence. Nearly 40 years later, none of those advantages remained. What survived instead was something investigators in 1988 could scarcely have imagined: a microscopic genetic fingerprint that had patiently endured while everything else slowly disappeared. The suspect, identified through investigative genetic genealogy, had lived an entire life since Dorothy's murder. He had watched the Cold War end. He had witnessed the rise of the internet. He had seen children become parents and parents become grandparents. Entire generations had grown up with no memory of the murder that had once terrified Harrington Park. Yet somewhere within every cell of his body remained the same DNA left behind inside Dorothy Donovan's home. DNA does not forget. It does not age into uncertainty. It remains indifferent to the passage of time, quietly preserving facts long after human memory begins to fail. Investigators now faced one of the most emotionally complex moments in any cold case investigation. They knew who they believed had committed the murder. The question was whether the justice system would ever have the opportunity to confront him. Background investigations accelerated. Every available public record was examined. Property ownership, employment history, marriage records, civil court filings, financial information, military records, medical history where legally obtainable. Detectives wanted the fullest possible understanding of the man they now believed had hidden in plain sight for decades. One detail became immediately significant. The suspect was elderly, far older than the violent man investigators imagined entering Dorothy's home in 1988. Age creates a strange contrast in cold cases. Photographs from the time of the crime often show youthful faces. The people eventually identified decades later bear little resemblance to those younger versions. Gray hair replaces dark. Wrinkles replace smooth skin. The passage of time softens appearances without altering responsibility. For investigators who had spent years pursuing justice, that contrast carried emotional weight. The brutal attack documented in the evidence belonged to someone physically powerful. The man now under investigation appeared outwardly fragile. But appearances had misled people before. Detectives never forgot what the crime scene revealed. The violence had been overwhelming, measured, relentless. Nothing about advancing age changed what had happened inside Dorothy's home. As prosecutors evaluated the case, they recognized another challenge unique to historical homicides. Important witnesses had died. Others suffered declining health. Some no longer remembered events with confidence. One investigator remarked privately that time is often the defense attorney's greatest ally. Human beings forget. Documents disappear. Businesses close. Neighborhoods transform. Even honest memories evolve after decades. That reality made the physical evidence even more important. Unlike witnesses, DNA cannot be influenced by suggestion. Unlike memory, it cannot become uncertain. Unlike testimony, it cannot simply forget. Still, prosecutors sought corroboration wherever possible. Old investigative files were digitized. Telephone logs were reconstructed. Maps from the late 1980s were compared against present-day satellite imagery. Addresses connected to the suspect were plotted against travel routes leading toward Harrington Park. No single discovery solved the case. Instead, investigators assembled dozens of smaller pieces. Each supported the same conclusion. Each reduced the possibility of coincidence. Meanwhile, Dorothy's family found themselves confronting emotions they had never expected to experience. For nearly 4 decades, they had lived with absence. Now they had to prepare for answers. Closure is often described as a destination. Families of homicide victims frequently reject that word. There is no finish line after murder. No moment when grief disappears. Knowing the identity of a killer cannot restore birthdays missed. It cannot replace conversations never had. It cannot erase decades of wondering. What it can provide is certainty. And certainty possesses its own quiet power. Investigators also considered whether they should interview the suspect before making an arrest. Experienced detectives understand that conversations with suspects can produce unexpected results. Some deny everything. Some offer partial admissions. Others attempt to explain the unexplainable. Occasionally, after carrying a secret for decades, someone simply begins talking. But interviews are unpredictable. They can strengthen a prosecution. They can complicate one. Every word must be weighed carefully. The investigative team planned each step with extraordinary precision. Nothing would be rushed. Nearly 40 years of waiting deserved careful preparation. Then came the development no one could control. Before prosecutors could bring the case into court, the suspect died. The news changed everything. Years of scientific work had successfully identified the man investigators believed responsible for Dorothy Donovan's murder. Yet the opportunity to prosecute him vanished forever. No courtroom. No cross-examination. No guilty verdict. No sentence. The criminal justice system had been overtaken by biology. Death ended the possibility of trial. For investigators, the moment produced deeply conflicting emotions. On one hand, the central mystery had finally been answered. The identity of the suspected killer was no longer unknown. Science had succeeded where decades of traditional investigation had failed. On the other hand, justice in its most visible form would never occur. There would be no public reckoning. No jury weighing evidence. No opportunity for Dorothy's family to hear a conviction announced in open court. The legal process had reached its limit. The investigation had not failed. Time had simply intervened first. Cases like Dorothy Donovan's forced difficult questions about the meaning of justice itself. Is identifying a killer enough? Does truth matter even without punishment? Can families find peace knowing who committed the crime, even if that person never stands before a judge? There are no universal answers. Every family experiences such moments differently. Some find relief in certainty. Others feel robbed once again. Detectives often describe these outcomes as partial justice. The truth emerges. Accountability does not. Still, investigators refused to minimize what had been accomplished. The DNA evidence had transformed speculation into identification. A case that had remained unsolved for almost 4 decades now possessed a scientifically supported conclusion. Future generations would no longer read Dorothy Donovan's murder as an endless mystery. They would read it as a crime ultimately unraveled by perseverance and forensic science. Inside law enforcement, the case quickly became a teaching example. Young detectives studied the investigation. Crime scene technicians examined the evidence preservation procedures. Forensic specialists highlighted the role of investigative genetic genealogy. Every stage offered lessons. Preserve evidence carefully. Never assume current technology represents the final limit. Never close the door on a cold case simply because years have passed. One retired investigator reflected that the detectives working in 1988 had unknowingly investigated for colleagues they would never meet. They collected evidence for scientists who did not yet exist. They preserved biological samples for technologies that had not yet been invented. Without realizing it, they were solving a case decades into the future. That observation resonated throughout the profession. Every unsolved homicide sitting inside an evidence room suddenly represented possibility rather than defeat. Across the United States, hundreds of cold cases began receiving renewed attention as genealogy continued proving its value. Victims who had waited decades for names finally received them. Families received long-delayed telephone calls. Investigators who had once accepted permanent uncertainty discovered that science had quietly expanded the boundaries of hope. Dorothy Donovan's murder became part of that larger story. Not because it represented the most famous homicide, not because it involved celebrity or extraordinary wealth, but because it demonstrated something profoundly important. Violent crime leaves traces. Sometimes those traces remain silent for years. Sometimes for generations. But silence is not the same as disappearance. Every carefully preserved piece of evidence carries the possibility that tomorrow's science will reveal what today's investigators cannot yet see. The murderer of Dorothy Donovan believed nearly 40 years had buried his secret forever. Instead, the smallest biological trace outlived memory, outlived changing detectives, outlived fading headlines, and ultimately outlived the man himself. His name emerged only after he no longer had the opportunity to answer for it in court. For Dorothy's family, the truth had finally arrived. Justice, however, had arrived one step too late. The announcement did not bring applause. It did not bring celebration. It arrived with the quiet gravity that accompanies every answer discovered too late. Nearly 40 years after Dorothy Donovan's life was stolen inside her own home, investigators finally stood before microphones with something generations of detectives had been unable to deliver. A name. For decades, the case had been introduced with the same painful phrase. Unknown suspect. Those two words had haunted every anniversary, every television documentary, every newspaper retrospective. They represented failure not because investigators lacked determination, but because the science simply had not existed. Now, that description disappeared forever. Instead, law enforcement explained how a microscopic trail preserved in 1988 had survived long enough to meet technology developed decades later. The explanation fascinated the public. Many people had heard of DNA. Far fewer understood investigative genetic genealogy. The idea sounded almost like science fiction. A killer leaves behind biological evidence. No direct match exists inside criminal databases. Years pass. A distant cousin uploads personal DNA while researching family ancestry. Investigators legally analyze those family connections. Genealogists reconstruct hundreds of relatives stretching across multiple generations. Slowly, methodically, the unknown individual is narrowed to a single person. No eyewitness. No confession. No anonymous informant. Only biology. Only mathematics. Only history. For the Donovan investigation, that combination proved stronger than 40 years of silence. Reporters immediately asked the question everyone expected. Why had the suspect never appeared on investigators' radar in 1988? The answer revealed one of the greatest limitations of traditional police work. Detectives can investigate only the information available to them. They interviewed neighbors, family members, friends, co-workers, known offenders, individuals identified through tips. But someone whose name never entered the investigation could remain completely invisible. Without DNA, investigators had no reason even to know he existed. The original detectives had not overlooked him. They had never encountered him. That distinction mattered deeply. Cold case investigators often defend their predecessors against criticism fueled by hindsight. Modern audiences sometimes assume older investigations failed because detectives made obvious mistakes. Reality is rarely so simple. Investigators in 1988 worked with the best tools available. They collected evidence meticulously. They documented the crime scene carefully. They preserved biological samples despite having no guarantee those samples would ever become useful. Their discipline made the modern breakthrough possible. Without their attention to detail, genealogy would have had nothing to analyze. The investigation became an extraordinary partnership across generations. One team collected evidence. Another interpreted it. Separated by nearly 4 decades, they ultimately solved the same crime together. Inside the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, Many investigators reflected on how profoundly homicide investigations had changed during their careers. When Dorothy was murdered, detectives relied primarily upon interviews, witness credibility, physical surveillance, informants, fingerprints, blood typing. Today, laboratories routinely recover DNA from biological traces nearly invisible to the naked eye. Computers compare genetic profiles within minutes. Digital databases instantly search millions of records. Genealogy extends investigations beyond criminal history into family history itself. Science had fundamentally altered the meaning of an unsolved case. But technology alone could not erase the emotional consequences. Dorothy's relatives had spent almost 40 years living beside uncertainty. Now they faced certainty without accountability. The distinction proved heartbreaking. Many families imagine the end of a murder investigation as a courtroom. A prosecutor presenting evidence. A defense attorney challenging it. Jurors listening. A verdict announced publicly. Instead, there would be none of those moments. No trial transcript. No witness testimony. No sentencing hearing. No opportunity to confront the man investigators believed responsible. Death had closed that door permanently. Psychologists who study families affected by homicide often describe uncertainty as a second trauma. Not knowing who committed the crime prevents grief from settling naturally. The imagination fills empty spaces with endless possibilities. Every unfamiliar face becomes suspicious. Every rumor acquires emotional weight. Every anniversary reopens unanswered questions. Learning the identity of a suspect removes one burden while exposing another. Families finally know. Yet they also realize they will never hear the killer explain why. Motive remained one of the investigation's most enduring mysteries. Investigators believed robbery likely played a role. Evidence from the home supported that possibility. Still, motive exists inside the human mind, not inside forensic laboratories. DNA identifies people. It does not reveal intentions. Only the offender truly knew what happened during those terrifying final minutes inside Dorothy's home. Did panic trigger uncontrollable violence? Did fear of identification escalate the attack? Did anger erupt unexpectedly? Those answers died with him. Detectives accepted that some mysteries would remain unresolved forever. The identity of the killer had been established. The psychology behind the crime remained beyond reach. As news spread nationally, criminologists highlighted another important lesson. Cold cases should never be measured solely by calendar years. Evidence does not become irrelevant simply because time passes. In fact, biological evidence often becomes more valuable as science improves. A hair recovered decades ago may produce results impossible when originally collected. A fingerprint dismissed as incomplete may later be enhanced digitally. A tiny biological sample once considered unusable may eventually identify an offender with astonishing precision. The Donovan investigation demonstrated this principle perfectly. The evidence had not changed. Science had. Police academies increasingly incorporated the case into training discussions. Young investigators studied not only the genealogy breakthrough, but also the remarkable evidence preservation that made it possible. Crime scene technicians learned the importance of documenting even seemingly insignificant material. Detectives learned patience. Prosecutors learned to anticipate technological change. The case offered lessons extending far beyond a single homicide. Meanwhile, residents of Harrington Park experienced complicated emotions of their own. Some remembered the original investigation vividly. Others had moved into the neighborhood years later, knowing little about the tragedy beyond occasional newspaper articles. For longtime residents, the announcement reopened memories nearly 4 decades old. Conversations returned to front porches, coffee shops, community gatherings. People recalled where they had been the afternoon Dorothy died. How frightened they felt. How parents suddenly insisted doors remain locked. How children were called inside before dark. Communities never entirely forget crimes that violate their deepest assumptions about safety. Even after decades, the emotional landscape remains altered. One retired patrol officer admitted the case had stayed with him throughout his entire career. Every time another cold case reached a dead end, he remembered Dorothy. Not because it was the bloodiest crime he had ever seen. Not because it involved extraordinary complexity, but because it represented unfinished duty. Police officers understand they cannot save every victim. They still believe they owe every victim an answer. Eventually, however long it takes. Investigative genetic genealogy has transformed that promise from aspiration into genuine possibility. Across America, evidence rooms contain thousands of unsolved homicide files. Each includes biological material waiting for improved technology. Each represents a family still hoping. Each reminds investigators that today's impossible case may become tomorrow's solved case. The Donovan investigation joined a growing list of examples proving that assumption correct. Yet the case also raised ethical questions. Genealogy depends partly upon individuals voluntarily sharing genetic information while researching family history. Many never imagine their DNA may indirectly assist homicide investigations. Supporters argue that solving murders justifies the approach. Critics emphasize privacy concerns. Courts and lawmakers continue debating appropriate boundaries. Regardless of those debates, one fact remained undeniable. Without genealogy, Dorothy Donovan's suspected killer almost certainly would have remained unidentified forever. The science had succeeded where traditional investigation reached its limit. As investigators archived the completed file, they paused over photographs taken inside the Donovan home on that terrible afternoon in 1988. Those images had remained unchanged through changing administrations, evolving technology, and retiring detectives. For nearly 40 years, they represented unanswered violence. Now they represented perseverance rewarded. Justice delayed. Not fully delivered, but undeniably advanced. The file would never again carry the label unsolved. Instead, it became something more complicated. A homicide identified through science after nearly 4 decades, solved too late for prosecution, but not too late for truth. And perhaps that distinction matters more than it first appears. Because murder seeks not only to end a life, but, over time, to erase memory. Dorothy Donovan's killer almost succeeded. Almost. In the end, it was neither a witness nor a confession that defeated nearly 40 years of silence. It was a microscopic fragment of himself, left behind without his knowledge on an ordinary afternoon in 1988, that refused to disappear, carrying the truth patiently through decades until the world finally learned the name that had hidden inside the evidence all along. For almost 40 years, the Donovan case existed in 2 different worlds. In one, it was a stack of aging evidence boxes sitting quietly inside a secured property room, visited only by detectives who refused to let another anniversary pass without taking one more look. In the other, it lived inside the minds of a family who measured time not by calendars, but by absence. Every birthday Dorothy never celebrated. Every Christmas without her voice. Every family photograph missing one familiar face. The 2 worlds rarely intersected. The investigators pursued facts. The family lived with consequences. When science finally connected them, neither side experienced the ending they had imagined. For the detectives, identifying the suspect represented the fulfillment of a promise that had survived generations. Some of the officers who originally responded to the murder scene were no longer alive to witness the breakthrough. Others had spent decades wondering whether they had missed something that day, whether another interview, another search warrant, another overlooked witness might have changed history. The answer, it turned out, was no. History had not defeated them. Technology had simply arrived too late. That realization offered an unusual kind of peace. The original investigation had not collapsed because of carelessness. It had reached the limits of what was scientifically possible in 1988. Every fingerprint had been checked. Every witness had been interviewed. Every lead had been pursued. The final piece had always existed. No one yet possessed the ability to read it. For forensic scientists, the Donovan investigation became more than another solved homicide. It became proof that evidence has a lifespan far longer than memory. Biological material collected during violent crimes often appears insignificant at first. A tiny stain, a microscopic cell, an invisible trace transferred during a struggle. To the naked eye, such evidence seems almost meaningless. Under modern laboratory analysis, it becomes a witness incapable of lying. Unlike eyewitnesses, DNA does not become influenced by media reports. Unlike suspects, it cannot invent alibis. Unlike memories, it does not fade with age. It simply waits. That lesson transformed cold case investigations across the United States. Police departments that once believed thousands of unsolved murders would remain permanent mysteries suddenly reconsidered their evidence rooms. Shelves lined with forgotten boxes no longer represented failure. They represented opportunity. Cases from the 1970s, the 1980s, the early 1990s. Each preserved biological sample carried new potential. The Donovan investigation encouraged agencies nationwide to reopen files that had gathered dust for decades. Some produced nothing. Others changed history. Within the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, younger detectives found themselves working beside retired investigators who volunteered their memories. The conversations were remarkable. Veteran detectives recalled details never fully captured inside written reports. How the neighborhood felt that afternoon. The expressions on witnesses' faces. The silence inside Dorothy's home after emergency personnel completed their work. The smell of fresh paint in one hallway. The weather outside. Tiny observations that never seemed important enough to document officially. Those memories no longer altered the outcome. But they reminded everyone involved that homicide investigations are conducted by human beings, not machines. Every detective remembers certain scenes forever. Not because they choose to. Because they cannot forget. The Donovan murder belonged to that category. Several investigators later admitted they occasionally drove through Harrington Park during the years after the investigation went cold. Not as part of official duties. Simply because unfinished cases have a peculiar way of following detectives home. They wondered whether the killer had ever returned. Whether he had driven past the house. Whether he had watched anniversary news reports. Whether guilt had ever entered his thoughts. Those questions remained forever unanswered. The suspect never faced interrogation. He never explained his actions. He never answered the simplest question investigators wanted to ask. Why? That single word echoed louder than almost any other. Why choose that house? Why that afternoon? Why such overwhelming violence? The crime scene suggested fear. Possibly panic. Possibly uncontrolled rage. But crime scenes reveal actions. Not thoughts. Some criminologists have argued that understanding motive provides emotional satisfaction more than investigative necessity. Knowing why rarely changes what happened. Yet families continue searching for explanations because human beings instinctively seek meaning in tragedy. Meaning, however, often refuses to appear. Sometimes terrible acts occur through a combination of circumstance, opportunity, and impulse rather than careful planning. If investigators' theory proved correct, Dorothy may simply have encountered someone who never intended to become a murderer until the precise moment their paths crossed. The randomness of that possibility remains deeply unsettling. Communities prefer believing victims were specifically targeted. Random violence threatens everyone. If an ordinary afternoon inside an ordinary suburban home can suddenly become a murder scene, then safety begins to feel fragile. Harrington Park experienced exactly that transformation. Residents who once left doors unlocked changed lifelong habits. Neighborhood watch participation increased. Parents became more cautious. Children received new rules. A single act of violence permanently altered the community's sense of security. Long after police cars disappeared, that psychological impact remained. Crime statistics often measure murders by numbers. Communities remember them differently. They remember where they were standing. Who called first? Which streets became blocked? How helicopters sounded overhead? How newspapers looked the next morning? The Donovan case became part of local memory in precisely that way. Even newcomers occasionally heard longtime residents mention the murder that had never seemed to end. Then, nearly 4 decades later, it finally did. Not with an arrest. Not with a trial. But with certainty. That distinction became central to public discussion. Journalists covering the breakthrough frequently asked prosecutors whether they considered the case solved. The answer was careful. From an investigative standpoint, yes. From a legal standpoint, the absence of prosecution meant the evidence would never be tested before a jury. Law enforcement emphasized that the identification rested upon modern forensic analysis supported by investigative findings. Still, because the suspect died before criminal proceedings could begin, the courts never reached their own conclusion. This balance mattered. Investigators remained committed to transparency. They explained the science. They described the genealogy process. They outlined the DNA comparison. Rather than asking the public to trust conclusions blindly, they demonstrated how those conclusions had been reached. The approach reflected an important evolution within criminal justice. Modern investigations increasingly depend upon explaining forensic evidence in ways ordinary citizens can understand. DNA possesses enormous persuasive power. It also requires careful interpretation. Context matters. Chain of custody matters. Laboratory procedures matter. Every scientific conclusion must remain open to scrutiny. In Dorothy Donovan's case, investigators expressed confidence because the evidence had survived decades of careful preservation. That preservation became one of the investigation's quiet heroes. Evidence technicians rarely receive public recognition. Their work unfolds behind laboratory doors and storage facilities. Yet without meticulous cataloging in 1988, there would have been nothing left to examine. Every sealed envelope, every labeled container, every log transfer between laboratories. Those administrative details eventually carried extraordinary significance. Future detectives inherited not merely evidence. They inherited trust. Trust that the material remained authentic. Trust that contamination had been prevented. Trust that procedures had been followed. Cold cases depend upon that trust. One missing signature can undermine years of work. One improperly stored sample can destroy the possibility of justice forever. The Donovan investigation survived precisely because generations of professionals treated evidence as though someone, someday, might still need it. That someone turned out to be detectives living in a different century. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the case was not the sophistication of the genealogy or the precision of the DNA analysis. It was patience. The patience to preserve evidence. The patience to reopen old files. The patience to accept that answers sometimes arrive decades after the questions. Modern society celebrates speed. Instant communication. Instant results. Instant information. The Donovan investigation followed the opposite path. It demanded years. Then decades. Then almost 40 years before science finally overtook silence. For Dorothy's family, that patience was never voluntary. It was imposed upon them by circumstance. They waited because they had no alternative. Every year without answers became another year, carrying uncertainty. Yet they continued believing someone inside law enforcement still cared. Someone still remembered. Someone still looked. That belief, more than anything else, sustained many families connected to cold cases across the country. Because as long as investigators continue opening forgotten evidence boxes, no victim is ever entirely abandoned. Dorothy Donovan's name proved that. Her case demonstrated that justice sometimes travels slowly enough to span generations. And although it failed to arrive before death claimed the man investigators believed responsible, it arrived in time to accomplish something murder itself could never achieve. It restored the truth. After nearly 4 decades of silence, speculation, and unanswered questions, the story was no longer defined by the identity of an unknown killer. It was defined instead by the extraordinary persistence of people who refused to accept that time should have the final word. There is a common belief that time heals all wounds. Cold case investigators know better. Time softens memories. It changes faces. It reshapes neighborhoods. But it does not heal unanswered murder. Instead, it settles over a community like dust, covering the pain without ever removing it. Beneath that quiet surface, the questions remain exactly where they were left. Who did it? Why did it happen? Could it have been prevented? Is the killer still alive? For nearly 40 years, those questions followed the Donovan family with relentless persistence. Friends stopped asking because they feared reopening old wounds. Reporters gradually moved on to newer tragedies. Detectives retired. New officers joined the department having learned about Dorothy Donovan only through archived case files. Yet the murder never truly became history. It simply became quieter. That silence is one of the defining characteristics of every successful killer who escapes justice. Life continues around the crime. The world adapts. The offender blends into ordinary existence. Morning coffee. Routine doctor appointments. Birthdays. Family dinners. Vacations. Perhaps even grandchildren. To everyone else, they appear to be living an ordinary life. Only they know that one terrible day remains buried beneath decades of normality. Investigators often wonder what that kind of secret does to a person. Does it become easier to carry? Or heavier? Does guilt slowly consume them? Or does the memory fade until it feels detached from reality? There is no universal answer. Some offenders confess after decades because they can no longer bear the burden. Others deny responsibility until their final breath. Many never speak at all. The suspect in Dorothy Donovan's murder belonged to that final category. He left behind no recorded confession, no detailed explanation, no apology, no interview in which detectives could finally ask the questions that had echoed since 1988. Everything investigators learned came from evidence. Everything they could prove came from science. The rest disappeared with him. That absence left one final mystery impossible to solve. What happened inside the house during those last terrifying minutes? Crime scene photographs reveal only the aftermath. Broken order. Blood. Silence. They cannot capture voices. They cannot replay conversations. They cannot reveal the exact instant fear turned into violence. Somewhere between the ordinary rhythm of that afternoon and the arrival of emergency responders, an encounter unfolded that permanently changed multiple lives. Perhaps it lasted only minutes. Perhaps less. Yet its consequences stretched across generations. Modern homicide investigations often rely upon digital evidence. Security cameras. Cell phone location data. Text messages. Smart home devices. Vehicle GPS systems. None of those tools existed in useful form during the Donovan investigation. Detectives in 1988 worked almost entirely without the technological advantages investigators now consider routine. That reality makes the eventual identification even more remarkable. The case was not solved because investigators possessed extraordinary technology at the beginning. It was solved because they preserved evidence carefully enough for extraordinary technology to emerge later. That distinction deserves attention. Evidence preservation is rarely dramatic. Television crime dramas focus on interrogations, arrests, and courtroom confrontations. Real investigations often succeed because someone carefully sealed an evidence envelope decades earlier. Because someone recorded the exact time an item entered storage. Because someone followed procedures precisely when no one imagined they would matter 40 years later. Professional discipline quietly defeated time. The Donovan investigation also illustrates another truth that criminologists frequently emphasize. Most violent offenders are eventually identified through persistence rather than luck. Luck may open a door. Persistence walks through it. Genealogical DNA did not automatically produce a name. It produced possibilities. Investigators still spent months constructing family trees, reviewing historical records, eliminating relatives, confirming timelines, conducting surveillance, obtaining comparison samples, verifying laboratory findings. Every scientific breakthrough still depended upon traditional detective work. Technology expanded the search. Human investigators completed it. That partnership increasingly defines modern criminal investigations. Science answers questions. People ask the right ones. Across the United States, law enforcement agencies watched Dorothy Donovan's case with particular interest because it demonstrated how cold case methodology had fundamentally evolved. Once, an unsolved murder often remained permanently unsolved. Not anymore. Evidence rooms became repositories of future opportunity. Many departments launched dedicated cold case units focused almost exclusively on re-examining biological evidence using modern forensic methods. Victims whose names had nearly disappeared from public memory suddenly returned to active investigations. Families who had stopped expecting answers received unexpected telephone calls. The Donovan investigation became one chapter in a much larger transformation. One by one, murders that had resisted solution for decades began yielding to science. Not every case, but enough to change expectations. Detectives who once believed certain investigations were hopeless became cautiously optimistic. Hope, however, remained balanced by realism. DNA cannot solve every homicide. Some killers leave no biological evidence. Some crime scenes become contaminated. Some evidence deteriorates beyond recovery. Some investigations suffer from incomplete documentation impossible to reconstruct decades later. For every spectacular cold case breakthrough, countless others remain frustratingly silent. Dorothy Donovan's case succeeded because several rare conditions aligned perfectly. Evidence survived. DNA remained recoverable. Genealogical databases contained enough distant relatives. Investigators reconstructed the family tree accurately. The suspect could be identified before every possible lead disappeared. Each step depended upon the previous one. Remove any single element, and the investigation might still be unsolved today. For the community of Harrington Park, the announcement brought reflection rather than celebration. Residents remembered how quickly fear had spread in 1988. Parents checking locks repeatedly before bedtime. Children instructed never to answer the door alone. Neighbors watching unfamiliar cars with unusual suspicion. Violence had shattered assumptions that suburban communities were somehow insulated from random brutality. Nearly 40 years later, those memories resurfaced. Older residents discussed the murder with younger generations who knew the story only through local history. Some admitted they had secretly believed the killer had died unidentified long ago. Others confessed they had occasionally wondered whether he might still be living nearby. The truth proved both simpler and more unsettling. He had lived an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary secret. Cases like Dorothy Donovan's inevitably raise another uncomfortable question. How many unidentified killers remain hidden behind ordinary lives? No one knows. Cold case investigators rarely speculate publicly. Privately, many acknowledge that unsolved homicide files represent people, not mysteries. Someone committed every one of those crimes. Some offenders have died. Others remain alive. Some continue living quietly in communities where no one suspects their past. The Donovan investigation demonstrated that time alone should never be mistaken for innocence. Years without arrest do not erase responsibility. They merely postpone recognition. The scientific breakthrough also reinforced public confidence in forensic evidence, but investigators consistently emphasize caution. DNA is extraordinarily powerful. It is not magic. It must be interpreted correctly, collected properly, preserved carefully, compared accurately, explained honestly. Every stage requires rigorous standards. The credibility of modern forensic science depends upon that discipline. In the Donovan case, decades of meticulous documentation allowed investigators to defend every step of the process. That transparency mattered almost as much as the science itself. Public trust grows when investigations reveal not only conclusions, but methods. As the completed file returned to storage, this time bearing a resolution unimaginable in 1988, detectives reflected on the remarkable journey the case had taken. What began as a brutal homicide in a quiet suburban home evolved into one of New Jersey's most significant examples of modern cold case investigation. The file itself told a story. Early pages filled with handwritten notes, black and white crime scene photographs, typewritten witness statements, later editions printed from digital databases, advanced laboratory reports, genetic analyses, genealogical charts stretching across generations. The investigation became a physical record of how criminal justice itself had evolved over 4 decades. Few homicide files illustrate that transformation so clearly. Dorothy Donovan never witnessed any of it. She never saw forensic science redefine what was possible. She never knew that detectives who had not yet entered law enforcement when she died would one day continue searching for her killer. She never saw generations of investigators refuse to surrender her case to history. In the end, that may be the most enduring legacy of the investigation. Not simply that science solved a murder, but that people refused to stop caring. Long after television cameras disappeared, long after newspapers stopped printing anniversary headlines, long after the original investigators placed the evidence into storage, someone still opened the file. Someone still believed the truth remained recoverable. And against extraordinary odds, that belief proved stronger than nearly 40 years of silence, carrying Dorothy Donovan's story out of the shadows and into the light, not through coincidence, but through patience, perseverance, and the quiet determination that even the oldest unanswered questions deserve one final chance to be heard. The final chapter of the investigation was written not inside a courtroom, but inside history. There would be no opening statements, no witness taking the stand, no defense attorney challenging forensic testimony, no jury disappearing behind closed doors to deliberate. The justice system never received the opportunity to complete the process that had begun on an ordinary afternoon in March 1988. Instead, the conclusion unfolded through public announcements, forensic reports, and the quiet acknowledgement that science had reached a destination the legal system no longer could. For many people, that distinction felt unsatisfying. Society has become accustomed to believing that every solved murder ends with handcuffs. Reality is often less orderly. Cold cases obey no script. Sometimes investigators identify the offender only after he has died. Sometimes the evidence emerges decades after statutes, witnesses, or circumstances have changed forever. Justice, in those moments, becomes something more complicated than conviction. It becomes truth. That truth carried enormous significance for Dorothy Donovan's family. For nearly 40 years, uncertainty had shaped every conversation about her death. Family members had answered the same question countless times. Has the case ever been solved? Each answer reopened the wound. No. That single word became part of their lives. Now the answer was different. Investigators believed they had identified the man responsible through advanced DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy. The uncertainty that had defined nearly 4 decades had finally ended. Nothing could undo the murder. Nothing could restore Dorothy. But uncertainty no longer controlled the narrative. Psychologists who work with families of homicide victims often explain that unanswered questions create a unique form of grief. The imagination fills every empty space. People invent possibilities. They revisit old conversations. They wonder whether they overlooked warning signs. They question decisions made years earlier. Knowing the identity of the suspected killer does not erase grief. It simply allows grief to stand on solid ground rather than shifting speculation. The Donovan investigation demonstrated that distinction with painful clarity. Investigators also reflected upon another aspect of the case that rarely receives public attention. Evidence preservation requires faith. Not faith in a particular suspect. Not faith in immediate success. Faith in the future. Every detective who sealed an evidence envelope in 1988 believed someone might someday need it. Every technician who documented biological material believed science might eventually advance beyond current limitations. That belief proved justified. Without it, Dorothy Donovan's murder would almost certainly have remained officially unsolved forever. Law enforcement agencies across the country increasingly viewed the investigation as evidence of why cold case funding matters. Cold cases are expensive. Genealogical research requires specialized expertise. Advanced DNA testing demands sophisticated laboratories. Investigators often spend hundreds of hours reconstructing family trees, reaching back multiple generations. The process cannot be rushed, nor can it be performed carelessly. Each mistake risks identifying the wrong individual. The Donovan investigation illustrated both the complexity and the extraordinary value of that investment. A murder once considered permanently unsolved eventually yielded to patient, methodical work. It also reminded investigators of an uncomfortable truth. Every solved cold case represents countless others still waiting. Across the United States, thousands of homicide investigations remain open. Some involve unidentified offenders. Others involve unidentified victims. Boxes containing preserved evidence sit quietly inside climate-controlled storage rooms. Inside many of them lies biological material collected decades ago. Technology capable of interpreting that evidence continues improving every year. What appears impossible today may become routine tomorrow. That possibility continues motivating cold case units nationwide. Dorothy Donovan's name joined a growing list of victims whose cases demonstrated the remarkable reach of modern forensic science. Yet investigators consistently warned against unrealistic expectations. Not every cold case contains usable DNA. Not every DNA profile can support genealogy. Not every genealogical search produces sufficient family connections. Science creates opportunity. It does not guarantee success. The Donovan investigation succeeded because extraordinary care had been taken from the very beginning. That lesson resonated deeply throughout forensic laboratories. Evidence technicians sometimes perform work that appears repetitive or administrative. Labeling, photographing, cataloging, recording chain of custody. Those tasks rarely receive public recognition. Yet decades later, they often determine whether justice remains possible. Every properly sealed package becomes an investment in the future. Every accurate record protects the integrity of evidence long after the original investigators have retired. In Dorothy's case, those quiet acts of professionalism became as important as the DNA itself. The murder also forced renewed discussion about randomness. Human beings naturally seek patterns. They prefer believing violent crimes occur for understandable reasons. Personal disputes, financial conflicts, revenge, jealousy. Those motives provide emotional structure. Random violence offers none. If investigators' conclusions were correct, Dorothy became the victim of circumstances beyond her control. An ordinary afternoon. An ordinary home. An unexpected encounter. The possibility remains profoundly disturbing because it offers no warning signs to recognize. No obvious danger to avoid. Only terrible chance. communities struggle to accept that reality. Harrington Park certainly did. The murder permanently altered local perceptions of safety. Even after decades, longtime residents remembered exactly where they had been when they first heard the news. Some recalled police vehicles lining residential streets. Others remembered television cameras gathering outside the neighborhood. Parents remembered reassuring frightened children despite feeling frightened themselves. Collective memory preserved details official reports never captured. Fear has remarkable staying power. So does resilience. Life gradually returned to the neighborhood. New families moved in. Children grew into adults. Schools welcomed generations of students who knew nothing about the murder. Time continued moving forward. Only the investigation remained frozen until science caught up. Perhaps that is why the eventual breakthrough resonated so deeply. It proved that history need not remain unfinished forever. Investigators often say every homicide victim deserves someone willing to keep asking questions. Dorothy Donovan had many. Some asked those questions in 1988. Others asked them 30 years later. Still others had not yet entered law enforcement when the crime occurred. Different generations. One shared purpose. That continuity may represent the greatest strength of modern criminal investigation. Cases outlive careers. Justice becomes a responsibility passed from one investigator to another. Nobody owns a cold case. Each generation simply protects it until the next becomes capable of carrying it further. Dorothy's file reflected that remarkable progression. The earliest reports were handwritten. Later supplements arrived through computers unimaginable in 1988. Finally came sophisticated genetic analyses identifying a suspect through family relationships extending across generations. One investigation became a timeline of forensic evolution. Each page documented not only a murder, but the changing capabilities of criminal justice itself. Even after investigators publicly announced their findings, many admitted the case remained emotionally complex. Identifying the suspect brought satisfaction. His death before prosecution brought frustration. The two emotions existed simultaneously. Neither canceled the other. That balance defines many successful cold case investigations. Truth arrives. Punishment does not always follow. Still, experienced detectives insist that truth matters. Names matter. Victims deserve accuracy. Families deserve answers. History deserves correction. Allowing a murderer to remain permanently anonymous grants him one final victory. The Donovan investigation denied him that victory. For nearly 40 years, he existed only as an unknown figure moving silently through crime scene photographs and investigative theories. Science eventually replaced anonymity with identity. The mystery that had once dominated every discussion of Dorothy Donovan's death no longer centered upon who committed the crime. Instead, it became a different kind of story. A story about patience. About evidence. About investigators separated by decades, yet united by purpose. About a microscopic biological trace surviving long enough to outlast fading memories, changing technology, and even the lifetime of the man who left it behind. In the end, the murderer escaped a courtroom. He did not escape the evidence. And sometimes, especially in the oldest and most difficult cold cases, that distinction becomes the closest thing history can offer to justice.